Hello there, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the M&M Show. Matthew has recently returned from Burgundy and the Burgfest 22 tastings, where they blind tasted their way through a lot of white wines from Premier and Grand Crus, different vineyards of Burgundy. And it's fair to say, having read your report, Matthew, it's a pretty good vintage.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've become a bit dismayed over some of the recent years of going into these tastings, be it Southwold or Burgfest, often approaching a vintage that was very well received on release and coming away often a little bit disappointed. Whereas this tasting, I went in expecting some really good white wines and came out really quite blown away by the quality. I think expectations, certainly on my part, with it, there would be some really delicious vin de plaisir, and in that very British way, we're slightly sniffy about pleasure because it lacks an element of the serious, right? Burgundy's meant to be proper and all that nonsense. But what I found quite quickly in the tastings was not only was there no lack of fun and pleasure in the wines, but they really satisfied on that next level as well. It's a terrific vintage.
Well, that's really good to hear. I mean, I'm not sure I quite agree with you about being dismissive of pleasure myself, but that's another point. So you're saying that actually it's right up there amongst the very best vintages of the century so far?
I think so, yes. I mean, that's a big call. And I wasn't part of the group when they tasted the 2014s, which is my benchmark for white wine in the 21st century, from Burgundy, that is. But members of the group who did taste the 14s were saying, look, 22 is up there. This is the most exciting white Burgundy tasting we've had. And I think that, for me at least, makes me listen. And these are people that know their onions. They've tasted lots of wine. And if they're saying this is at least in the same conversation as 14, that's, demands a bit of attention from me.
Well,
my own feeling is that I can see that there's maybe a rivalry there, and I'd love to try more of the 2 years side by side. I think it's certainly better than 17, and I think it's probably going to be, eventually we're going to see 14, 24, and I think 22 as the three top years of the first quarter century.
Right, okay, so that puts it right up there as questioned. And obviously, we're reading through your report. We're talking about the same sort of conditions over and over again. Obviously, we've just come back from Bordeaux, having been tasting the 25 vintage, another incredibly hot year. Obviously, every year has differences, but we are reading more and more about the solar vintages, and clearly winemakers and techniques, etc., are overcoming all these climate change issues. And from what sounds like a really incredibly hot year, they're making absolutely tip-top quality wines. So are we to assume now that climate change is not that worrying for us in the wine world?
No, I think that would be a bridge too far. I think climate change is a massive ongoing challenge to winemakers throughout the world. I think people and vines are getting better at dealing with it. So there's definitely a school of thought out there that will say that the vines themselves are evolving and developing to ameliorate the effects of climate change. I think that's quite a grand claim, but I'm not going to dismiss it entirely. Of course not. I think at the same time, you shouldn't overlook the extent to which people are getting better at dealing with climate change. I mean, the way that you train the canopies, etc., etc., etc. I mean, you can manage ripeness and sugar accumulation in the vines to try and match the pace of sugar accumulation. So you can try and sort of match climate change there. I think with the 22 vintage, without getting too deep into a sort of a weather report, because that's best left to Michael Fish and those guys. It shouldn't be dismissed, the fact there were some big rain events through the spring in 2022, which meant that the water reserves in the soil were replenished. And the other thing that's really pertinent to us in the UK at the moment, you know, the reason that our heat wave right now is so oppressive is that it's not cooling off at night, right? I mean, I really struggled to sleep last night as it's sort of 28 degrees still. But they did have a decent diurnal variation in temperature in Burgundy in 2022. So the nights were getting a bit cooler. And that's the big contrast with a year like 2003, when they were experiencing conditions much closer to those we've got right now in the UK.
Yeah, well, I spent 2003 summer in Burgundy, and I remember Lyon averaged 40 degrees for the entire month. So yeah, it was very warm. So what have you got there in your glass?
Well, in preparation for this, I did have a look to see if I had any 22s on hand, because I thought that would be appropriate. Sadly, I didn't. So
you thought you'd open something anyway?
Well, you know, 2020, can you see that?
Yes.
2020 Bourgogne Blanc from Paul Pio, who I think is one of the very greatest white winemakers working in the Côte d'Or today. And Thierry Pio is enormously talented. And, you know, he made some of my favorite wines from Chassagne in the 22 tasting. I absolutely love what he's doing. And I think the Bourgogne Blanc is really on a level with many people's village wine.
Yeah, I'm sure. And other shout outs for particular producers that you enjoyed in the 22 tasting?
22 tasting, I think for me, my personal favorite throughout the whole thing was probably Pierre Girardin, you know, sometimes called Pierre Vincent Girardin. But it just, there's always a confusion of names in Burgundy, right? So now you've got Vincent Girardin, you've got Pierre Girardin, sometimes called Pierre Vincent Girardin, you have Pierre Vincent, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. But I think the Pierre Girardin wines in 22, it's the first year we've had a significant lineup from him in the tasting, and I was blown away across the board. They are kind of divisive in that there's got quite a heavy winemaking signature, not dissimilar to the way that Louis-Michel Léger-Belair has a heavy winemaking signature.
Yeah.
The Pierre Girardin wines have quite a lot of reduction. They're very spicy. There's a clear kind of stamp of oak, but beneath all that, there's such a wealth and depth of fruit. I thought they had an absolutely storming vintage. Everything from Merceau Perrier through Bâtard Montrachet, Courton Charlemagne, they were almost consistently top of class for me.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Obviously, his reputation is building and building, and everything up from him I've had has been spectacular, so I can understand that.
We had Santa Bain in London the other week, didn't we?
Yeah.
It was lovely.
Indeed. And Chablis versus the Côte d'Or, or any particular villages that you'd like to mention? Or I mean, it's pretty consistent vintage, right?
Not 100%. I think consistency is really important if you're going to call something as a great vintage, because there's no point having, you know, totally isolated spikes of greatness. You've got to have a rising tide on which all ships. Now, I think 22 does have that crucial consistency, although I'd say Chablis, for me, struggled a bit. I know some of my colleagues differed in their opinion. I just felt that Chablis was probably the least able to cope with the heat and the drought of this vintage. And I really didn't get that steely, lean, focused saline quality that I'm looking for. I know Chablis can manifest itself in different ways, but for me, it was only when we got into the Grand Crus that I found real excitement in Chablis. And I don't think that's going to, it's not enough for me to say it's a great Chablis vintage.
Okay.
You know, you taste Monte de Tonnerre, for me, that should be knocking on the door of Grand Cru quality. And I just didn't see the highlights amongst that category in this tasting.
Okay.
But if you're looking for, you know, the converse of that, and where did I see, you know, a hotspot of quality, I think Merceau is absolutely tremendous. It was tasting the Merceau that I first started to think, you know, this is maybe a great vintage that we're looking at. With, you know, we start the Premier Crus with things like Porozo and Boucher, and then accelerate through our perceived quality hierarchy, if you like,
Yep.
finishing up with Perrier, and some of those Porozo and Boucher. I was just like, wow, this is sensational. And then you move into Genevrier and you go, wow, it's kind of upped the pace. Charme, it's upped it again. Perrier, wow.
Right.
I thought that was absolutely thrilling.
Okay, so if it's got Meursault, Pierre Giraldin, and 22 on the label, you snap it up, correct?
I think I slapped 98 points on his Meursault Perrier.
Right. Okay, that's good enough for me. I hope that's good enough for everybody else. Matthew, thanks again.
Cheers.
Cheers.